Hello, my name's Kathy Greven. I'm from Greven and Co. We are financial strategists for life for our clients through accounting and financial planning strategies. Today I am joined by Angus Sippe from Human Financial. He is the Chief Investment Officer and heads up the development of investment strategies and design and has over 20 years in investment management experience. As an accountant as well as a financial planner, I see a lot of misspending and people asking about, various tools and how they can overcome. But it's not a simple fix in so much as it's your habits more so than anything else. And it's really getting into the mind, the psyche of, when you go to the shops and you see something, are you addicted to buying stuff because just for the fact of buying, or is it something you need or that's something that you want, and so it's really getting into that mindset. And as you say, there are a lot of tools out there, but one thing I've noticed is with the banks are now starting to with your online banking, be able to identify, this is shopping, this is health, this is, sort of segmenting your spending a little bit. So making that a little bit easier, which is really good. If you could, if they could go one step further and sort of get a report at the end of the year or every 6 months or however, what is that total shopping, and break up those expenses. When I do that for clients, I see that as a huge wake-up call, especially around the takeaways and the dining out is a massive. I had one client recently that didn't realise they spent over $1,000 a month on takeaways, so, and it's a family of 3. So it's a lot. So, just being aware of those things really, really help, and sort of reaching out and getting support. And as you say, there's a lot online to help. But leading on from that, if you're sort of saving, and we're looking at super, which is terrific. Most people these days have super for the rest of their lives. So when they do get to retirement, they will have a reasonable nest egg, which is great. But then people sort of are talking about alternatives as well at the moment, and the types of different sorts of alternatives you can have, like crypto, Bitcoin. You've got things of buying, antique cars, art, and also alternative type investments. What's your thinking around alternatives as a mix, not total, a mix in your portfolio?
Yeah, and I think it's got to be about why you're driven to alternatives, and investing actually to be successful investing requires patience. And there's an interesting stat where apparently 95% of Warren Buffett's wealth was created after the age of 65. In fact, he wasn't even a billionaire till the age of 56. So there's no get rich quick scheme. So you need to think about alternatives. People should be free to invest their money their way. But in today's world, there are just too many scams out there that often are linked to some of these alternative investments. So you kind of got to rank them on a spectrum, and you've got to understand what's driving you into alternatives, because alternatives can have liquidity issues where their money is locked up for years. There can be transparency issues of what you own and then how that's valued. And then the fees, which also sort of leads into transparency. There can be some higher fees that aren't particularly well advertised or disclosed. And ASIC's got a big focus on those type of things on a number of alternative at the moment. So, you won't know with certainty the outcome of those investments for years or potentially decades. And without that ability to source your funds, it becomes more and more problematic. So when you're looking at these alternatives, I think you need to look at why, and is it because the excitement of the expected return? Is it a passion project for the likes of classic cars? Is it about losing faith in traditional finance? And then you overlay that with a healthy level of skepticism. And if you're still convinced on these things, I would say start small and keep it small. Because these alternative investments, they're not going out and creating new asset classes. They're often breaking up asset classes into different pieces. And they do sometimes involve some sort of financial engineering, which can become problematic in stress periods. So depending on where your answers lie with some of those key questions, I think as long as you keep it small, then you won't get yourself in any sort of too much hot water.
I think you're right in that respect. And alternatives as a financial advisor, I'm sort of err on the side of caution in terms of especially when I'm dealing with self-managed super fund people who want to do it their way, and buying property, not an issue. But then they just think, well, I've just bought my property and that's all I'm going to do. And it's like, well, no, we now need to still keep investing. We still need to start diversifying, And it's like, oh, I don't know how to do that. And, so you just sort of get a mixed bag of people wanting to do different things, but then, just do one thing, but not see the whole picture. And I think that's where, getting advice helps to keep you in line in terms of, building an investment strategy that's worthwhile and valid for what you want to achieve at the end of the day. Because the issue is having these alternative investments. You're right in that when you want to come to sell them, where do you sell them? Who do you sell them to? Even a commercial property can take time, or even a residential property in a self-managed super fund can take time to sell, depending on the market at the time when you're wanting to sell it. And you can't sell a few bricks off, or you can't sell a tyre off a car or anything like that. You've got to sell the whole asset. So, in that respects, I think you need to be mindful of, like you say, why you're doing this, if it's a passion, but also how much you're willing to allocate. And then it just gets back to budgeting again, doesn't it? Sort of sitting down, working out that strategy and moving forward in that respect. So self-managed super fund is very good for that, and we specialise in that sort of area. But it's not the be-all and end-all from it all. But a lot of fund managers are actually starting to invest in alternative investments, aren't they?
They are. And like I said, there's a spectrum of these, and a lot of fund managers can be sort of late to the party once they see sort of the flows coming through. And certainly there's a lot of question marks about the efficacy of, say, private equity at the moment that locks capital up for 10 years. Certainly the best funds, which you hear about, do very well, but the kind of median or average fund may not do particularly well versus public markets. And all these things, as I said, if you start small and stay small, don't ever sort of rock the boat too much. But this is where financial advice is important, is about portfolio construction and working with your advisor and using them as a sounding board to make sure that you're not in some of these asset classes where the probability of success can be so far down the track or questionable that a lot of people look at the rosiest of outcomes and they don't look at sort of the reality or the worst outcomes for what it could mean to their financial retirement.
Absolutely. It's a bit like going down the casino and putting it all on black, thinking, yeah, that'll do. It just doesn't work. It just, it's that's just too risky. I don't think anyone's prepared to do that. But the classic.
And the other thing is, Kathy, so just to mention is, as you said, the transaction costs for getting out of some of these things can be quite huge, and the carry cost or the maintenance cost of some of these real assets. A classic car portfolio costs a lot of money in mechanical and upkeep, and then to sell a car like that has 5, 10, 20% type transaction costs on them. So while that could be a fun way to invest, it's certainly not going to create a fortune for you and likely to sort of underperform the broader market.
Correct. And, what I like to tell my clients is that, industry funds are part of that alternative investment strategy, in so much as, they buy, like CBUS is classic for, buying into the buildings that they're working on. Australian Super has 30% of their investments tied up in these alternative assets, which, most people aren't aware of. So, it's being aware, and if you're happy and accepting of that, that's fine. But if you're not aware, it's very small print on the website. You can find it, but it is tough to find. So, it doesn't roll with the markets like, say, alternative in a a master trust somewhere like a Macquarie or a Hub or an IOOF kind of scenario where it's very transactional. What you see is what you get, and there's no hidden investments underlining it. And for me, it's all about transparency. So, but do you think that the fund managers will get into the crypto and the Bitcoin investing? Are they now?
You're certainly seeing passive ETFs options coming through. And the other thing with alternative, and they're more liquid, so they're less like the property or sort of some of these private assets you referenced. Which the other problem is they might seem like a good idea now, but you're in Boston investing for 5, 10 plus years, and economic environments change. So almost certainly asset managers will get into more and more cryptography and those type of assets over time. But the underlying fundamental use cases of those are still questionable.
Right.
So we're likely to see that it will become more and more mainstream. The likes of the mega investor in the US, BlackRock, are trying to put up to 2% of their model portfolios into cryptography and things. And interestingly, since that announcement was made, which you would assume is a very positive demand factor in there, the asset price of some of these major Bitcoin and the like hasn't actually moved meaningfully. So
right,
they will become more and more mainstream, and then into sort of mainstream portfolios. I think the question is the portfolio construction around them at 2%. It's not necessarily going to result in financial ruin, but the needle moves. Once you get 2% in there, then the question is why not 5, why not 10, why not 20%? And that's kind of probably where the big allocations in the industry funds have ended up to with alternatives, where you said 30, some of them are up to 50%.
Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate your pearls of wisdom. And and hopefully you have a good week, and we'll catch up. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy.